Well, thank you, Gene. Good afternoon, everyone, to the parliamentarians, the diplomats, distinguished guests that are here. 2 years ago, the people of Cuba took to the streets chanting down with the dictatorship. Government forces tried to silence the protesters with tear gas and violence. Afterwards, I had a Catholic priest from Cuba visit me here in Washington. He told me about a young man who came to see him in church. The young man said to him, and I quote, "I would fight. I would give my life for the cause of freedom, if only someone would know that I died. If only someone would know that I died." I think about that kind of incredible bravery 2 years later, and I know that in the long term, democracy will succeed. That's why I'm so grateful to have a chance to speak to you as we close out this second Summit for Democracy. And we see the challenges of democracy globally and the challenges to those who seek to uphold its basic underpinnings at a moment that a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Evan Gersovich, has been wrongfully and illegally detained in Russia. These are the challenges that those countries represent. At this critical time, we must come together with our allies to confront the cabal of authoritarian countries that we face around the world. Now, I know you have spent a good part of the summit speaking to the potential of artificial intelligence and technology to meet this global challenge, but I'd like to take this opportunity to broaden out that conversation a bit. I want to say to Secretary Blinken, who I know will be here shortly, that I want to thank him for being a strong partner in this fight for democracy, and to join so many from all across the world who care so deeply about this cause. This is a fight that is very close to my heart. My parents came to the United States as refugees from Cuba, escaping a dictatorship. They did everything they could to get to this country. To them, the United States was truly a shining city upon a hill. And growing up in New Jersey, my family had to struggle to give us a shot in life. But as hard as that struggle was, we knew that we had a chance because we were free. Free to pursue our goals, free to work where we please, free to speak out for what we believed in. When I look around the world today, I see average people who are willing to risk everything for the cause of freedom and democracy. Iranian women who took to the streets despite the tear gas, torture, and executions. The Burmese who peacefully protest a military dictator that has kept a boot on the neck of their nation's democratic ambitions. The Uyghurs who stand up for human rights even as Beijing uses biometric data and facial recognition technology to repress them and very often have them in a concentration camp. And in Ukraine, despite bombing maternity wards, despite the targeting of civilians, despite Putin's nuclear threats, Ukrainians have fought back. Now, freedom is not set in stone, and democracy is not a finished product. It is something that we need to continuously fight for and defend. That's why just 2 days ago, I held a democracy hearing at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And when I looked out across the table at our witnesses, I could see the fire burning in their eyes. Leopoldo Lopez, who was brave enough to speak out against the brutal Venezuelan regime. They tortured him, they sent him to solitary confinement, but he comes out of prison fighting for freedom. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is widely believed to have won an election against a dictator in Belarus, she was another one of our courageous witnesses. Such relentless drive of these freedom fighters inspires me each and every day, which is why I led the bipartisan passage of the State Department authorization last year. From the Cyber Bureau to the Global Internet Freedom Funds, it is a vision for taking on the challenges of the future. And this year, Senator Risch, the ranking Republican on the committee, and I are working on another bill to put us on a stronger path to our challenges with China. With resources and staffing, it will strengthen our economic tools and our engagement throughout Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa to make sure we are advocating for democracy and human rights. It'll modernize our tools to combat digital authoritarianism and disinformation. Because if democracy is going to succeed, we need the most up-to-date, cutting-edge technology on our side, much of which you have heard and or engaged with for the last 2 days. We need to keep the internet on when dictators try to turn it off, to shield the identities of journalists and political activists, to stop commercial spyware from being used to target human rights advocates, and to track autocrats' stolen wealth using both open source data and financial forensics. As vanguards of the democratic order, we all know what's at stake in this fight. That's why in the coming weeks, I'll introduce legislation to counter authoritarianism and help those fighting for freedom. It will create a limited visa category to provide safety to human rights defenders and democracy advocates. It will address transnational repression and combat the corruption that nourishes autocratic regimes. We need to defend the principles that free people cherish and millions more yearn for around the world today. It's our job to continue on with the legacy started by the likes of Aristotle and Correus in Greece, by Thomas Jefferson, Cesar Chavez, and Martin Luther King. Today, this legacy lives on in the names like Caramusa, Tishkonashkaya, Otero, Lopez, and yes, Zelensky. As defenders of freedom and democracy, we must take up that mantle. It is our turn in the arena, our turn to stand in the shadow of these giants and defend the principles that they dedicated their lives to. Now, I've been at a lot of these gatherings where commentators like to say that around the globe, democracy is backsliding. The autocrats have the upper hand and the good guys are on their back foot. But I tell you they are wrong. Wrong because I believe we are in the midst of a global democratic renewal, one where Democrats and freedom fighters are seizing the initiative and standing up for their rights. My friends, I've been fortunate to champion these issues in Congress over the past 3 decades. In this time, I've come to learn that solidarity with democracy activists is a lifelong endeavor, not one tied to a specific democracy program or summit. Our work is never complete and requires constant tending. So I'd like to share 4 observations based on this experience. First, to our Secretary of State, U.S. diplomats must consider support for democracy and human rights central to their role in advancing U.S. interests. They need to be trained and incentivized to carry out this mission around the world. If we say democracy is under threat, then our diplomats must be an essential part of the frontline response. Second, to those who may be parliamentarians here in this room and beyond, international solidarity and action from our legislative bodies is essential in the global fight for freedom. I work with teams of chairs of foreign relations committees from around the world to support democracy and human rights. With our joint statements, with our legislative ideas and initiatives, we are a strong voice for freedom, particularly at times when our governments cannot or may not go as far. So I urge my counterparts to join this effort and make sure that legislators are a robust voice in this cause. Third, we must be agile and ready to support those democracies facing economic hardship. The president of Zambia, a strong partner of the United States, recently said, and I quote, "You can't eat democracy." He's right. So when a country is trying to do the right thing, we need to move quickly. Whether it's U.S. private investment or through USAID, DFC, or MCC, we need to show democracies can deliver for their people. And fourth and finally, we need to support all the elements of democracy. That's why I was glad to speak at this event representing the first branch of our democracy. We need to support small d Democrats, civil society and political parties, independent labor unions, and journalists. Finally, let me close with a few words from a letter that Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza wrote me after he was arrested in Russia. He wrote me and he said, quote, "Soviet dissidents like to say that the night is darkest before the dawn," and they turned out to be right. He went on to say, "Despite everything, I know that one day Russia will be free, and we will always be grateful to those who stood with us at this most difficult hour." As someone facing up to 20 years in a Russian prison, it was moving to see him quote human rights advocate Erwin Cutler, who said, "The worst nightmare for a political prisoner is to be forgotten." So to Vladimir and all the jailed Russian dissidents, we will not forget you until you are free, and do not give up hope. To those who have been forced to flee their homeland, do not lose hope of return. To those who are living in the shadow of a brutal dictatorship, do not despair. If we dedicate ourselves to the cause of freedom around the world, I believe democracy will flourish, that light will win over darkness, and that we will triumph over tyranny. The work that you are doing here is so critical to make that a reality. Thank you very much for having me with us.